1 Corinthians in chapter number 13 today, and I'm looking forward to telling some of you guys to stop being childish. And it's not your wives, it's the men that I'm talking about. And so, all right, so 1 Corinthians 13. Let's start in verse 1, and we'll read down to the end of the chapter, just 13 verses. The Bible says, "Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not charity, I'm become as a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains and have not charity, I'm nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. Charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Charity never faileth, but whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I am known. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three. But the greatest of these is charity. So the passage we've just read is very often called the love chapter, known as the love chapter of the Bible. And it's because the Greek word, we find the word charity over and over and over in our King James Version. We find that word charity over and over and over in there. And the other versions of the Bible actually just simplify it. They just say that it means love. But the Greek word for that is translated charity here is a word, it's agapeo. Not agape, it's agapeo. And it's believed to be coined, that word is believed to be coined by the Apostle Paul to describe the kind of love that a Christian has for his or her church, according to the International Bible Encyclopedia anyway. That word is only found, that the first time that the term agapeo is found in Greek literature is in 1 Corinthians in chapter 8. Where it talks about charity edifieth. And that is the first time that it's used, and that it is a particular term. It's not talking about the love that we have for our spouse, or it's not talking about, sacrificial love. A lot of times we'll think about love that way. The agape love means sacrificial giving love, but that it is in fact a specific kind of love. It is the love that a person has for his church. And so, a lot of times February comes along and we have our Valentine's or sweetheart banquets or whatever, and someone will bring a message, and they'll bring a message out of this chapter, and they'll say, this is how husbands, you should love your wives, and wives, you should love your husbands. And they'll use 1 Corinthians in chapter 13 to describe that kind of love, that we have for a husband and for our spouse and so forth. But the passage really has and I'm not saying, by the way, that it's wrong to use it that way, but the passage has a much more specific use than that. And I think that specific term is very important for us to get down. It's talking about our love for our church. And the reason why we shouldn't use the word love, we should use the word charity, is because it reminds us that this is something different. This is talking about something entirely different. We as believers, we ought to have a connection to our local church and the body that is part of that church, and there ought to be a unique kind of love that we have for a church. So the introduction of the chapter is actually, to chapter 13, is actually in 1 Corinthians in chapter 12. I want to read verses 28, 1 Corinthians 12, verses 28 through 31 to you. And the Bible says there, "And God hath set some in the church, first apostles, secondary prophets, thirdly teachers, after that miracles, then gifts of healings, helps, government, diversity of tongues. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Are all workers? Are all workers of miracles? miracles, have all the gifts of healing, do all speak with tongues, do all interpret, but covet earnestly the best gifts, and yet show I unto you a more excellent way. And then he goes next, right then. I mean, don't take a break, chapter 13. Don't take a breath there and say, okay, brand new thought, brand new topic going on. Though I speak with the tongues of men and angels and have not charity. He's talking about the same thing. He's talking about the church, the apostles, the gifts that are in the church. And so some of the things that we've already looked at from chapter 12, God has set the gifts in the church in order. Verse 28, chapter 12, verse 28. First apostles, then prophets, and then lastly speaking in tongues and the interpretation of tongues. But God has set in order these gifts in the church. And God has not made all of the Christians, God has not made it so that all Christians have the same gifts. Chapter 12, verses 29 through 30. And so he says, he's got all that. Are all apostles, are all prophets, are all teachers? And the construction of these questions demand a no answer. Are all apostles? No. Are all prophets? No. Are all teachers? No. Are all workers of miracles? No. Have all the gifts of healing? No. That's the way that ought to be understood. And just as not everyone is an apostle, not everyone is a preacher, and not everyone is supposed to speak in tongues, is what he's trying to teach, what he's trying to get across right there. God's given something, and then he tells us in verse 31 that God's given us something much better than these spiritual gifts. But covet earnestly the best gifts, and yet I show unto you a more excellent way. Now he goes into chapter 13, and he's going to teach us this more excellent way. Something better than spiritual gifts. Something better than coveting and saying, I want this gift, I want that gift, I want to develop this gift, I want to develop this strength or whatever. Something that's better than all of that. And that's what he's getting. He begins to develop that for us in chapter 13. So essentially Paul is saying, people, instead of trying to get all these spiritual gifts, let me show you something better. You ought to seek charity. That's better. And doesn't the Bible teach us that if we love God and love our neighbor, we'll fulfill all of the commandments, all of the law and the commandments? So something is better. This thing of charity is better than all of the the healing, the gifts are all of the gifts combined. All right, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. So let's get in here and look at this. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. First of all, we've got what I'm going to call the importance of charity. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 1 through 3. Though I speak with the tongues of men and angels and have not charity, I am become as a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and have all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. So Paul makes it clear to us that no gift is worth having unless charity is behind its use. Yeah, these people coveting this gift, and I have tongues, and I have healings, and I have the abilities to speak a word of knowledge, and I can prophesy, and blah, 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 and they're doing all of these kind of things. And Paul says, it really doesn't matter what you can do if you aren't doing it under the basis of your charity. He uses charity. We might speak with miraculous tongues, but they're just confusing, deadened sound without charity behind them. It doesn't matter how golden-tongued the speaker is if he isn't sincere. It doesn't matter how, Jack Hyles used to talk about, he said, I always preach with a tear in my eye. And he said one time he had a lady, because Dr. Hyles was a pretty confrontational kind of preacher. And he said one time in his church he had this lady and got up, he'd be preaching, and she'd get up and she'd leave the room. And then pretty soon she'd come back in the room. She'd leave the room, get out, and then next week she'd come back to church and she'd get up, leave the room, and get mad at him, leave the room, come back in the room, leave the room, come back. One day she said, I get so mad at your preaching, but I'm drawn to the tear in your eye. Sincerity, charity, love, concern. That you do what you do out of actual, genuine concern, charity, love for the people of God, for the people that God has brought into the church. Sometimes in a local church, there are times when things are said that can be from the pulpit or in other places that can be that are hard to swallow. But if there's love, charity, if there's genuine charity, love for that person and their attachment to the local church, it changes everything about how it is taken. We might stand before men and preach the mysteries of God and be one of those guys, that everyone says, wow, I can't believe the wisdom of this preacher. But without charity, it's nothing. Years ago, I went to a meeting, and the guy that was preaching, I'm going to not say this guy's name, but the guy that was preaching, I had never heard him preach before, but it came off. It was real easy to see him when he was at the, before the meeting started. He was kind of standoffish, and just some of the remarks that he was making seemed snide, and just seemed arrogant, and like he just. But he got through preaching, and after he got through preaching, there was someone who had a concern about what he had preached. I can't remember exactly all of what had happened, but this person goes up to one of the preachers. The preacher had a group that traveled with him, and this guy went up to one of those who was traveling with the preacher, and the guy that was traveling with the preacher tried to protect the preacher from the person who had this concern, and what caught my attention was when the preacher noticed that his traveling companion was blocking someone's access, and as soon as he noticed it, he went right up to that person, and when the person expressed the concern, he sat him down on the front row of the church. Service is over, and people just kind of milling around and that kind of stuff, but he sat him down on the front row of the church and took like a half an hour and just went through the problem. Made things right and explained what he was saying and all that kind of stuff. I don't know, I wasn't privy to the conversation, but I was just impressed that, it looked like he was just kind of cocky, arrogant guy, but he really did love people and wanted to be a help to them. It's an amazing thing what happens if you have genuine concern, love for people. We might exercise the serving gifts, and sometimes we think of, like there are certain spiritual gifts, or there are certain things that a person might do that are kind of scare you. You kind of shy away from. But if a person's a servant, the kind of person who's just going to pick up things and be there and help, and that seems like that kind of guy. Everybody loves that kind of a person. But even if you're a servant and you don't do it with a heart of charity, it's a worthless act. It doesn't matter how much time we give it doesn't matter how much we give of our time, our talents, our treasures. If we're not motivated out of charity, out of love for what God is doing in His local church, it's most likely not going to be useful in the long run in the cause of the local church. Charity gives expecting nothing in return. That's the idea of the agape part of agapeo, giving expecting nothing in return. And anytime we even do what is right and we do it expecting something out of it, it just turns it turns into something that is useless. Our motive for serving ought to be to give. It's more blessed to give than to receive. It ought to be to give. We ought to want to give to and contribute to and build up and be a help to the local church. God's Word says that if our motivation is anything other than to be a blessing, and I'm going to just to the local church, well, it's a useless act. Charity is what makes exercising our gifts valuable. So the importance of charity. Then secondly, there are the characteristics of charity. That's found in verses 4 through 7. And so it goes, charity suffereth long, it is kind, envieth not. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. And again, notice the selflessness of this charity. suffereth long, the different points. Suffers long, is kind, envies not, vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, rejoiceth in truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. It never fails. Any spiritual gift, whether it's I'm going to use sensational gift, a speaking gift, or a serving gift. Sensational, I mean by the charismatic ones. Speaking in tongues, the gift, interpretation. The charismatic would say that the ability to foretell the future, which I would question whether that ought to ever have been considered a spiritual gift, but the idea of being able to foretell the future or to word of knowledge, prophesy something, give a brand new message, something that added to the Bible. Those are the sensational gifts, and that I believe have now ceased. We're going to see that in just a minute. But the sensational gifts, the speaking gifts, that would be the apostle and the prophet and the pastor and the teacher. The speaking gifts, and then the serving gifts. That's the person who's got the gift of giving or ruling or mercy or something of that nature, ministry kinds of things. And whether it's sensational speaking or serving, if it's not ministered out of charity, it's selfish in nature. It's look at me, this is what I want. In fact, I doubt if it's a true spiritual gift. If it's done without a heart poured into the work of God, I doubt that it's a spiritual gift at all. And then finally, there is this thing, the endurance of charity. The endurance of charity. Verses 8 through 13, charity never faileth. Whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I'm known. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three. But the greatest of these is charity. So one good reason to seek charity rather than the spiritual gifts is because you can't lose. As you exercise charity, the Holy Spirit will see to it that you're also exercising your spiritual gift. So think about it would be possible for a person to focus on the spiritual gift, the gift of ministry. The gift of ministry, the idea of seeing a need and trying to meet that need. Gift of ministry, seeing a need, trying to meet that need. And a person could say, boy, I really want to be known for having the gift of ministry. I want people to know me as the kind of person that sees needs and meets those needs, that I am able to recognize a need and to do whatever it is that I can to make sure that need is cared for. It might be the need for cleaning a building. It might be the need for replacing something that's broken or fixing something that's broken. It might be the need of helping somebody who is injured or something of that nature. It might be the need of seeing someone who is going without and finding a way to meet the physical need that they have. And as a person could say, I really want to be known as the kind of person who has the gift of ministry, and I want to be known as the kind of person who reaches out to others. And so what he does is he begins to, some people actually teach this stuff, develop his gift. He recognizes his strengths and his weaknesses, but this is a weak area in his life, his gift of ministry, and he wants to develop his gift of ministry. He wants to become better at it. He begins to develop his gift, but he's doing it so that people will know him as. So it would be possible to develop, to seek a spiritual gift without ever gaining charity. On the other hand, I think Paul is saying, if you'll just be charitable, if you'll just choose to love God and love your neighbor, if you'll just seek to love your church and to pour yourself into your church, God will see to it that your own combination of spiritual gifts will work. And the benefit of that is, then you don't have anyone saying, well, I got this gift and you got that one. You don't have the toe saying to the hand, I have no need of thee. Chapter 12. Because everyone's just loving in their church. Not loving, it's mushy love, but I mean loving their church, giving to their church, helping their church, building their church, caring for their church. And in doing that, God then just makes float to the surface in their life the spiritual gifts that He has chosen for their lives. Rather than them focusing on, well, what is my spiritual gift? They're focusing on, how can I be a blessing? How can I be a help? How can I be a benefit to my church? And as that happens, God just naturally makes the gifts that they're supposed to use rise to the surface. So you just can't lose. If you seek charity rather than spiritual gifts, you just can't lose. So the crux of the passage is this, that spiritual gifts will vanish. Whoa, what happened right then? How did that happen? I pushed the wrong button there, so He'll fix it for you. And so the spiritual gifts will vanish away. The importance of charity, characteristic, one more, I think. Maybe I didn't even need to switch it. That's what it was. I didn't need to switch anything, did I? I flipped buttons I was supposed to leave alone. Don't touch. Anyway, so the crux of the passage is that spiritual gifts are going to vanish away. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time trying to explain theologically why I believe that, it talks about when that which is perfect, verse 10, when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. I could, if I wanted to take the time, explain what that means theologically. I don't mean to do that today. But what I do want to show you is that the Bible says that these gifts are going to vanish. He implies that there are certain things that will cease. There are certain gifts that will vanish away. And when these gifts vanish away is not important. And why they vanish away is not as important to the context of what I'm trying to get at today than is the fact that they do vanish. And so Paul makes it sound like the only things that'll continue to abide, through the course of time are three things, he says: faith, hope, and charity. Those are the things that are going to abide. Those are the things that endure. Everything else seems like it's going to vanish away at some time. Since the sensational gifts, sensational spiritual gifts, have no enduring value, they ought to be put aside for something more enduring and maybe, can I say, mature? Because he's going to use that idea of childishness. So here's something that he says endures. And he says, and here's something you put away like a child puts away his toys when he becomes a man. It's like Paul is saying, these gifts that you're after, the speaking in tongues and the interpreting of tongues and the healings and the performing of miracles. He says that's childishness. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. Have you ever watched what they do in a charismatic church? If that isn't childishness, some guy standing up and he pops you on the head and you fall over backwards, but you got to have two people there to catch him because they're going to be popped on the head. That's childishness. So that's what Paul is saying. He says there comes a time you put away childish things. It's childishness. Children want to draw attention to themselves. Children want to, it's when you have a group of children together and little ones, and someone begins to pay attention to one of them, the children want to be the one. They start coming around and saying, no, pay attention to me. That's childishness. And Paul says, when I became a man, I put away those sorts of things. When I was a child, verse 11, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. So each of these things mentioned in verse 11 answers to one of these vanishing gifts. So spake as a child, answers to tongues. Thought as a child, answers to prophecy. Understood as a child, answers to knowledge. Those are the sensational gifts that he's been speaking about there, that he's addressed in chapters 12 and 13. And these things have been put aside, he says, for more mature things like faith, hope, and charity, because those things abide. And then he says, of these three, there's faith, hope, and charity. But then he says, of these three things that abide, charity is the greatest of those things. And that's because it'll be the only one of even these great three that continues on into eternity. It's interesting. Faith, the Bible tells us we don't need faith when we get to heaven. And faith, hope, and charity. We don't need faith that is seen is really not faith anymore. Now faith, Hebrews 1 and verse 1, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. But once you see it, why do you have no reason for faith anymore? Hope that is received isn't really hope anymore. Romans chapter 8 verse 24, for we are saved by hope, but hope that is seen is not hope. For what a man seeth, why doth he yet hope for? So he says the greatest of these are the things that abide, faith, hope, and charity. The greatest of these is charity. And I think the reason for that, I think at least one reason for that, is because when you get to heaven, there's no faith anymore, there's no hope anymore. But there still is a reason for charity, for pouring ourselves into the benefit of the whole. So here's the more excellent way. Instead of seeking a spiritual gift, seek charity. It's probably not going to make you the most noticed person in church. It's probably not going to make you the one that, charity isn't one of those things where everyone's going to say, wow, look at that. Have you ever seen such great charity? That's probably not going to happen. And it's not going to make you distinctive. We can't all have like the same spiritual gifts. The Bible tells us that. And because we don't all have the same spiritual gifts, all of us look differently in the spiritual gift category. But all of us can have charity. So we all just kind of become one in charity. And then remember that your spiritual gift, you've got your spiritual gifts, but they'll have no profit unless you have charity. And remember that charity always seeks to serve rather than to be served. And that charity will endure when everything else will cease. And so the best thing, he says, the thing that we ought to seek, the more excellent way, the best thing that we can do with our lives is just learn charity. Which is, again, I say it like this, it is a unique love that you have for the church that God placed you in, fitted you to be a part of.